Oysters are being harvested again in the Apalachicola Bay after a 5-year break. Gina Jordan sits down with Regan McCarthy and Diaz de Villegas to hear about their trip to the bay. We'll also hear voices from the community, including a longtime oysterman.
Oysters are back.
Yay!
Yay! Specifically, we're talking about Apalachicola Bay, and this is good for a lot of reasons.
Very excited. I'm going to get all my girlfriends here tomorrow. We're going to have lunch.
Regan, Rob, you guys took a trip to the bay recently to see how things are going now that temporarily we can harvest these oysters again. This is the first time in 5 years.
Right.
Yeah, so the bay had been closed for a 5-year moratorium. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission closed the bay to wild oyster harvesting to try to give the oysters a little time to recover. The fishery officially collapsed in 2013 because of a lot of things like drought and overharvesting. So the idea was that they would spend some time researching that area, rebuilding parts of the bay, and then giving those oysters some time to just recover and regrow. And then January 1st was the first day people could go out and start harvesting.
Right. And so we went on January 13th, and a lot of people had already done it. It's a very limited season, so it's only through February 28th, and people, only a certain amount of licenses were given out, and they were each given a number of tickets for 60-pound bags. So there's a really strict limit on how much they could harvest. And by the time we went out, a lot of people had already gone through their limits. So restaurants were some had their stockpiles and were good for another week or two, and then some seafood markets had already run out.
Yeah, and it seems like so far, I'm hearing from the FWC, they feel like the harvest is going well, and people are getting some big oysters out of the bay. The opening continues through the end of the month, so I think we'll see, how that goes. We'll know more information once this month closes.
And you mentioned that in 2013 is when the fishery collapsed, but then harvesting was continuing after that?
Yes, harvesting continued, and we talked to some researchers who'd been looking into the health of the bay. One thing they mentioned is that because the harvesting was continuing even while they were doing efforts to try to restore the bay, it seemed that a lot of the harvesting was happening where those restoration efforts were being made, and so it wasn't allowing that restoration to really take hold and happen. And so that's why that decision was made to close the bay officially to wild oyster harvesting until January of this year.
Gotcha. Okay, so you guys ate some oysters on your trip?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, we did.
Yeah,
Yep.
And I know you met some people who were over there excited to be eating oysters and harvesting oysters.
Definitely. So we got to catch up with a few people. We went into Apalachicola and met Penny Nichols at the Hole in the Wall restaurant and oyster bar. So she moved to Appalach like 6 years ago, and she says she'd been visiting friends and family there for decades, and she was just so excited to be able to eat like the wild Appalachia oysters, and she says she really wants to bring some of her friends back the next day.
We're going to have lunch and have the Apalachicola Bay oysters. We've been looking forward to it for a long time. Been at all the meetings trying to get, the oyster fishermen to be able to harvest again. So it's crucial to Apalachicola economy. I mean, without the oysters earning a living and doing their thing, all we really have is our tourist industry to rely on. So it's crucial for Apalachicola. I paid $25 for a dozen yesterday, and if you get them in Atlanta, they charge you like $3.50 and up per oyster. So I'm okay to pay for locally caught, wild Apalachicola Bay oysters. $25 is still a bargain, I think.
And Penny did mention that she's really excited to have these wild caught oysters. She says she likes them better than the farmed oysters.
Yeah, that's what I hear. Rob, what about you? First of all, do you like oysters?
Oh, yeah, I love oysters.
Okay.
Yeah, like wild caught and farmed. I've gotten used to farmed. I guess, a lot of us have over the last 5 years. Yeah.
Are the wild caught usually bigger?
Yeah, so we talked at Hole in the Wall, we talked to the guy behind the bar was telling us. So a farmed oyster, they don't have as much regulation as far as like when they can harvest them, so when they can take them out of the water. So they might not even be a year old yet. Whereas with a wild-caught oyster, they have to be 3 inches. In Apalachicola Bay, Sandra Brook at the FSU Marine Lab was telling us, and I've always heard from oystermen that about 18 months is about what it takes to get to a market-size oyster, though in other places it takes about 3 years. There's extensive wetlands that are intact along the Apalachicola River, which gives a lot of nutrient flow down from Tupelo swamps and places like that into the bay, whereas other places might have more development. And it's just that the Apalachicola River has like hundreds of miles of wetland connected to the river. And so that's always been the reputation, intact wetlands equal extra nutrients, equal, fast-growing, really resilient oysters, usually, if there's, that substrate on the bottom of the bay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Nice.
yeah.
So you guys talked to some more folks at Hole in the Wall?
Yeah, Bonnie and Jay Giving are two snowbirds. They're down from Iowa, staying in Destin. And so when they heard there were wild-caught oysters available, they drove all the way from Destin to Apalachicola to try them out.
We thought we'd come over and see if we could sample them. And
I'm not a big oyster fan. They were tremendous. They were thicker, bigger, and saltier for some reason. And I ate a whole one and loved it, but he got the rest.
I ate the rest, yeah. We were having oysters over in Destin and happened to hear that they had these available now. That was worth the drive.
Definitely.
And we got to see the coastline, too.
Oh, beautiful.
So one thing that I think we should point out is a lot of these restaurants, including the Hole in the Wall, have been really just been able to offer these oysters as they're available, kind of sporadically. And so Rob mentioned, some of these oystermen have already gone through their tag limits. We're not sure at this point if there are still people who've got oysters or the ability to continue harvesting oysters based on their tag limits. And so it's unclear, who's got oysters left available. But I think it's worth a call if you're interested in trying out some of those wild caught oysters.
Right.
Yeah.
I just saw one of the seafood markets that had run out weeks ago. I interviewed that day we went out. I stopped at Mineral Springs and they said they'd been out. And then all of a sudden they just got more just recently. So, it just depends on when people decide to go out and use those tags.
Right. I talked to some oystermen who said they were going to kind of wait till the end of the season because then their oysters would be like a little bit of a hotter commodity, right?
Yeah.
Some of the people went through their tag limit immediately at the beginning when the rush was really exciting. And then some people said, I'm going to wait till the end. And then people will be so excited that there's still some left.
Doesn't get any fresher than that.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
So these oysters in the bay have been able to live untouched for 5 years. And I understand that some are so big they've grown hair. What in the world?
So when an oysterman brings up oysters, when they're tonguing up is chunks of an intact reef system. And so when they come up in these giant chunks, what he had found, and he said he had never seen that in that part of the bay, but it's just like a grass-like, basically grass growing on top of these oysters, which I guess kind of shows you that they haven't been touched in several years. I guess you would consider maybe more of a natural state.
Yeah, I actually got to eat one of the oysters moments after it came out of the water. We went out with an oysterman who has actually been oystering since he was 6 years old. He's 68 now. And so we went out with him, got on his boat with him, got to see him use the big oyster tongs, which for anyone who isn't familiar, they're kind of like a 12-foot long post hole digger with some garden rakes attached at the end. And I actually helped him tong some of the oysters up from the bottom. It was hard work. Those were heavy, y'all.
Wow.
And we pulled a big pile of oysters up, dumped them on the boat, and he shucked one for me right there. And I slurped it out of the shell right from the water. And it was such a cool experience getting to talk with Roger Mathis. That's the oysterman we went out with. And I think we've got a little bit more of our interview for y'all to listen to.
This is probably the most burred up stuff we got that we're working on. But they big old oysters in it. You can see how big they are. You got to knock them apart. You can see what I'm doing to them. I'll even let you grab them tongs if you want them.
I do. I want to give it a try.
You got to knock them apart like that. And you see them little rocks they're growing on?
Yeah.
That's what they planted out here. I grew up oystering, and then I hauled oysters. But right there by David Barber's Seafood, I got an oyster house I've had since '82. But 2017, the last time I come out in 17, I worked about 4 hours and caught 15 pounds of oysters. That ain't even what that right there is. The oyster's just gone. So I just quit. I come over here and started cleaning houses for my wife. But 2019, they planted some stuff, and I worked it for a little while. And then I'm back out here now.
How did you feel about the bay closure then?
Well, it closed itself. Now, them closing it, I didn't really agree with it, but it closed itself because when you can't catch nothing, they don't nobody come out and work it. But the bottom had just disintegrated. There wasn't nothing out here on the bottom. You couldn't even pick up nothing. This is the biggest oysters, most oysters I've seen out here in a long, long time. Last time oysters was this thick was probably 1980. They planted these rocks out here. Now that's what we work in. You see that buoy right there? And there's one over there and there's back over here. Anyway, this is the area we can work. This is East Hole. So this is the biggest area we work. We get more, we got 15 bags we can catch. But these little old tags that you see right there, it's got all them serial numbers. Everybody that applied got 31 of them tags, and that's all you can catch for a 2-month period. So, they got it pretty restricted, regulated. But they planted, I don't even know exactly, they might have planted this stuff in 2017. It took a while for it to grow.
Yeah.
But it's so thick down there now, you can't even get your tongs in it.
Yeah.
I'm tickled to death. Because this is what I've done for a living all my life, besides drive a truck. And it's in your blood. It's in your blood, that's what you do. I love this. If they'd let us stay open now, just as soon as my tags is up and everybody that's working with me tags is up, then I'm done. I'm going to have to go back to doing handyman work again until October.
How much do you get for a bag?
$65 for a 60-pound bag. When I started catching them, they was $1.50.
For a bag?
For a bag. When I was 12 years old. I was 6 years old. Because we caught shuck and stuff. But when I was turned 12 years old, and that's about 1970, they was $1.50 a sack. When they went to $2 a sack, I said, we're going to get rich. But I used to come out after school. My daddy, he'd come out and catch oysters. Then he'd come in, and when we got off the school bus, you could come out here and catch you a couple sacks of oysters. $4 for a 12-year-old boy every afternoon. That's pretty good money. If you buy them wholesale, that 60-pound bag is $100. That's $25 a dozen. Let me show you what they look like when they come up. You got it? There we go. But it's so thick down there right now, you see it don't take just a second to get it. Just takes longer to cull it than it does anything. But that, my friend, is oystering. That's what we do here all day long.
Yeah, so, we got to see, and I'd been covering Apalachicola Bay for, really just starting after the crash. It's when we started the ecology blog, it was a marine biology thing, and so we started, one of my partners on the blog was studying it. So I've been going out on oyster boats for a while, and I've only seen people sort of take up little bits of shell and not intact reef, and so this was a really cool experience to see a lot of large oysters come up. A big mound of oysters on the cold board.
Yeah, and one thing that I thought was really cool to see as we were watching Roger tong those oysters up, and then he did this thing called culling, which is where he uses a culling tool, but it's
an iron,
metal,
culling iron, I guess is what you call it.
Yeah, it's a metal, foot-long pole stick that he whacks these oysters with, and the idea is to break the oysters apart, breaking off the baby oysters to get the big oysters so they're market size. But he was also breaking off a lot of the limestone rock, which is what the researchers had been putting down in that area where he was harvesting to create what's called substrate, or the material that the baby oysters can attach to so that they can grow there. So they were putting limestone rock there to sort of restart an oyster reef growing in that space. And so we could see him pulling some of that up with the oysters.
That is very interesting about the limestone. So that was Roger Mathis, an oyster man who just sounds like as genuine and authentic as it comes. I know nothing about oyster harvesting, so it hadn't occurred to me that these things that they use were so long and heavy. It does sound like a lot of work.
Yeah,
tongs,
and interestingly, Roger has a couple different sizes depending on how deep the water is.
10, 12, and 14 maybe?
I know he has a 12, yeah.
Yeah, I forget what the third one is. Yeah.
Yeah. But so he's got all these different lengths to work on. And oyster tongs are becoming kind of a rarity. They're usually specially made, and as the culture and maybe you could even say the art of wild oyster harvesting has gone away with the closure of the bay, the people who make those tools and those supplies have gone away too. And so being able to get tongs and to get an oyster boat has actually become a lot more difficult now.
When the bay was closed for 5 years too, I mean, these are all, they're wooden boats, they're wooden tongs, and he was saying a lot of them had kind of rotted as they sat. that, and now they're not being replaced because, there aren't people to do that. So it's just a lot of people weren't keeping up with, maintaining that over the 5 years.
Yeah. So you guys talked with Dr. Sandra Brook of the FSU Coastal and Marine Laboratory. She's a researcher, and I know she talked a lot about the limestone and ways that they were able to sort of build the fishery back up. In general, what was her perspective about the bay reopening just for these 2 months?
She would prefer that they were closed another 5 years, but, as to the point of having oyster tongs and boats available, she realized that if there was ever going to continue to be an Apalachicola Bay fishery, that it needed to open so people could continue doing the work of, using oyster tongs and having oyster tongs and boats that were in good repair. Right now, she pointed out, only about 50 acres of the bay is being harvested of what was restored. And so I was looking at an FWC report before I came here. So 10,000 acres was what had historically been there. So we're talking about a 0.5% of the bay is being harvested right now. So obviously more restoration work needs to be done and more. And she also told us, I guess, that only 10% of, they've surveyed the bottom and they're only allowing about 10% of what they think is there to be harvested. So they're taking a cautious approach and letting it regenerate more, I guess. And I know there's more restoration to come. I saw something like $16 million, at least so far, has been approved for more shelling or more material to be put down at the bottom.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think one thing that stuck with me that Sandra pointed out is that oysters serve multiple purposes, right? They have like an ecological, environmental purpose, which includes helping to clean the water in the bay and making reefs that can protect our coastline. And they also have an economic and cultural purpose, which is where the fishery comes in. She says, when we're talking about the health of the bay and restoring the bay, there are different goals there. Some of those goals could be ecological and environmental, and some could be economical and cultural. Balancing the needs of both those things is what she and our state wildlife officials are looking at now.
Okay, here's a little snippet of your conversation with Sandra Brook of the FSU Coastal and Marine Laboratory.
I don't actually know what's inside an oyster. I mean, it sounds to me like you're saying basically there's a digestive tract and some reproductive organs, and that's what I'm eating when I eat an oyster?
There's that mostly, yes. Different times of the year, the reproductive part is more and less dominant, and then they have the gills and the little pumping mechanisms, the heart, and then there's the foot that keeps the valve open and closed. They're uncharismatic little animals that are incredibly important to the ecosystem. So I like the fact that they're there, and I think they're very undervalued in terms of what they contribute to our ecosystem and human well-being.
Mm-hmm. I want to turn to the Apalachicola Bay. You've been studying the bay for some time now?
Yes, that's correct. Since 2019.
And what kind of study do you do?
The grant that we're working under is the Apalachicola Bay System Initiative. The fishery collapsed in 2013. There were several restoration efforts, but the populations didn't recover. And so the idea of this grant, the mission, if you will, was to try and understand why the oysters collapsed, why they weren't recovering, and how we could join with stakeholders to develop a way forward.
Mm-hmm. We had a moratorium on wild harvesting in the bay. That moratorium has just been kind of lifted. What are your thoughts on what's happening now?
Since the fishery closed, we have seen signs of recovery in some parts of the bay. Primarily those places where the restoration efforts used limestone. There were several limestone deployments, and not all of the sites have recovered. But in 5 of those sites, over the time that the fishery is closed, we've seen the market-sized oysters reach the threshold to support a fishery. I think if it's managed properly, then it'll be okay, but it's very vulnerable right now. The bay, that is, the populations of oysters. Now, the way FWC have opened the fishery, they've decided to only harvest 10% of the market-sized oysters that were in these 5 particular areas. They've allowed people into the fishery based on certain stipulations, and then they divided the number of allowable oysters between those people. So each person has an allocated bag limit, number of bag tags. The key here is enforcement.
Okay. So I went out on the water with a oysterman whose family had been wild harvesting for generations. And he seemed really pleased with what he was able to harvest. Everybody compares Apalachicola oysters to maybe oysters from other parts of the country or the farmed oysters that we've been getting. And these are big, like hand-sized oysters that people are getting out. And for him, that indicated these oysters had been able to grow for a long time. There were lots of them. This means, yes, the bay is all better.
Well, so I think, you've got a problem here of what we call shifting baselines, going from pretty much nothing, which is what it was when the fishery was closed. I went out there in the early 2020. There were no reefs. The habitat was so badly depleted. I think that was a big part of the problem with the oyster populations, was the lack of a good, stable substrate. The good thing about Apalachicola is that it's an extremely productive system, and oysters can grow to market size in 12 to 18 months. But as we know, it's really easy to overharvest it when you have a limited amount of area to harvest from. So yes, you've got small areas that have quite a lot of oysters over that 400 bags an acre threshold, but you have an awful lot of the bay that has nothing or very little.
Okay. I'm fascinated. Apalachicola oysters grow faster. Can you explain that?
It's nice and warm. There's lots of food in the system. They have peak spawning periods in the spring and then another one in the fall, but they keep producing. They kind of dribble on all through summer. It's warm and there's lots of food.
So much of what I've heard in the past about what happened with the bay has to do with the overdraw of water up the river, drought and overdraw of water, increased salinity in the bay, and then the increased concerns about oyster drills and predators being able to move into the bay. Based on this conversation, it sounds to me like, the water salinity wasn't really the problem after all. It was really the rocks.
Well, oysters are ecosystem engineers. They build their own habitat, right? So if you don't have the oysters, then the habitat will start to erode. Apalachicola's hydrodynamics are like an angry washing machine. That's the way I think of it. It's very dynamic and it's very strong currents. And so if you don't have the oysters maintaining those reefs over time, they will erode away, be harvested away. Now, this is where the reshelling approach can help. Florida used to have a reshelling program so that they took the shells that had been shucked from harvest and they put a proportion of them back on the reefs to replenish them. That reshelling program was defunded in 2011, I believe. Now you've got a half-shell market and the shells get dispersed to restaurants miles away. So anyway, we lost the reshelling program. The oysters declined, and the drought situation was probably responsible for a lot of that. When you have a drought, the salinity goes up, and things like marine predators can move in, and the oyster drills are really voracious, extremely abundant predators. High salinity also increases disease, increases physiological stress. And so this high salinity situation creates oyster mortality. We had a series of droughts from 2003 all the way through to when the fishery collapsed and harvesting continued. There was also the oil spill. Even though the oil didn't reach Apalachicola, there was a fear that it would. And so if you look at the harvest track record, there was a big spike in 2011, which is also when the juvenile population collapsed. So when a system collapses like this, it's usually not one thing. It's a culmination, a perfect storm, if you will, of a number of things that have been developing over time. That's, I think, what happened in Appalach. The oyster populations, there were indications that they were declining back in the early 2000s.
Is there any evidence that having an intact reef like structure would have made them more resilient to drought?
So the thing about a drought is that it kills the oysters. Now, if the habitat is still intact, that means there's somewhere for those oysters to go. If there isn't stable substrate that those oysters can land on, then there is no real way to kickstart the system again.
Can we ever go back to like Apalachicola Bay oysters were once like so renowned and provided, I don't remember the stat, like 10% of the world's or the United States oysters. Can we ever get back to that place?
Well, if it's managed properly and if somebody is willing to throw millions upon millions of dollars of restoration into Apalachicola Bay, from what I've seen, the system itself is resilient. I think you could, with enough investment and enough care and enough management, you could get back to a place where the oyster reefs and oyster populations in Apalachicola are significant. Now, the fishery, there's a slightly different element there. If you opened up a fishery in Apalachicola Bay with massive reefs, if somehow you could flip a switch and there were as many oysters as there were 3 decades ago, there probably would have to be a fairly significant period of time of ramp up because people got out of the fishery. I mean, you see people that have been in it for generations. Most of them, their kids are not going to be oyster fishermen. It's really hard work. And so it may come back. I mean, if the oysters were there, maybe people would want to invest in the fishery and have it come back. It could recover to the point where it's a significant part of the economy. But I think that would take a lot of investment, certainly a lot of investment in the oysters, and also a cultural shift back to the way it used to be.
That was Dr. Sandra Brook of the FSU Coastal and Marine Laboratory. Regan, you've been working hard on this story for NPR and for us. Thank you. And Rob, folks can see pictures and video and learn a lot more about this on your WFSU Ecology blog. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both for this deep dive into the Apalachicola oyster industry. Very cool.
Thanks, Gina.
Thanks, Gina.